we have Joel
That's Joel.
Tosa, and we have Ed Matthiesen from Wenck going to talk to us today about wetland hydrology. So I know it's kind of boring just to read this little announcement, but it's kind of what we've been doing. So Ed is the water resource engineer at Wenck with 40 years of experience. So working as a district engineer for Coon Creek Watershed District, Shingle Creek, and West Mississippi Watershed Commissions in Hennepin County. So welcome, Ed. And Joel is water resources engineer with more than 30 years of experience. You may have read hired by the Corps to teach a hydrology course, so it's of interest. And Joel, they've both been involved with hydrology projects, so I will let you guys get started with that. Thanks for being here today.
Yes, ma'am? Yes, I did. Okay, very good.
Good.
So, thank you for asking us to come and speak to you today. I think you're all wetland biologists, I would guess, in this room. When Matt asked me to speak, he said there's a broad range of ability or experience in this group. So, my part of this talk is to talk about hydrology generally in the more general terms and how we apply it to wetlands. And Joel is going to speak more specifically about wetland sites. Interestingly, I think, is how Joel and I kind of approached this, because we were on the case studies that he's presenting on opposite sides, kind of on opposite sides.
We've always been on opposite sides.
Yes. So I work for watershed organizations, so I kind of represent the regulatory side, although I do some wetland work. And Joel had projects, one in Rice Creek and one in Coon Creek, that I was reviewing from the other side. So now we work at the same company, so we have to play nice together. We don't have to, but it kind of ends up that way. So anyway, I think it's kind of an interesting perspective as how we'll be able to kind of explain some of these case studies we'll get into. So again, here's my experience. I'm coming from more of a generalist side of it, about how we look at projects that come into the watershed organizations I work with related to hydrology. On the watersheds I work with, there are professional staff, Matt being one of them, that know a lot more about wetlands than I do. So I am the resource for the engineering side. And then Joel has a lot of experience, and he also has taught classes at the University of Minnesota. He's got a lot of credibility when it comes to the hydrology and hydraulics side. And not knowing it up there, Joel also has his PhD from the University of Minnesota in civil engineering. So what I want to talk about in the kind of general terms here is how we look at this for, on the wetland side, is what's the definition we have for hydrology, units, watershed delineations, rainfall runoff. We'll go through then some examples. So, generally for the definition for wetland hydrology, specifically for hydrology for the wetlands, is we look for the inundation period, and also we look for the volume of runoff that's coming through. As I'm looking at it on the regulator side. So one of the things we look for, and I'll show a description here later, is we look for, on a project, what's the change in volume, pre-project, post-project? Is there going to be a change in hydrology? So we look at that to determine what the, make some estimate about the duration of inundation for that 14-day period. And then we also look at what's the saturation zone to within 1 foot depth of, in the growing realm for the rooting zone. So inundation is saturation by surface or groundwater at a frequency of duration sufficient to support the vegetation overlay control. So when is wetland hydrology most important? Well, generally that comes up from the regulator side, is when somebody wants to do a change in land use. So generally it's always going from, say, a farm area, some wetland is kind of impeding their development plan, to how they can maximize their most economic output for that wetland. So then that requires probably work that most of you do is some delineation work. And then we look at also impacts on the groundwater, which is a little harder animal for us to get our hands on. That's the one I probably struggle most with, is what's going to be impact on the groundwater because there's less information there, and the duration of sampling is much longer than taking some surface water analysis. So, one of the examples I work with quite a bit, Matt gets his hand in this quite a bit, is sod farms in Blaine. Easily ripe for development, but a lot of underlying issues there. So what we look for hydric soils. Those pop up a lot, and that is there, or that's why the sod fields are there, because they're easy to grow on that. They do strip away just a little bit of that hydric soil, but a very minimal amount, because otherwise they lose the resource to grow the sod. We look at the vegetation over time. Mainly though, you have to look at the soils because the vegetation over time would be sod. And then we look at the hydrology prior to ditching. Well, most of our county ditches that I work with, and this would be true for Rice Creek, where I'm familiar with, as well as Coon Creek, were built between 1890 and 1910. So in order to make an estimate of prior to ditching is really tough because all of our records show that they've essentially always been there. But we try to make some example, trying to get some understanding of what that lateral effect is from these ditches and how they drain the system. So, in this case, is wetland hydrology applicable to the entire sod farm or parts of it? So now we look at the hydrologic cycle. And this is kind of in general terms here, but you can see that the groundwater flow is kind of uncategorized here, because that is with the lake, losing water through the ground through the lake, as well as some surface influence. So the groundwater flow is a little tougher to get our hands on. But how does that apply to the wetland water budget? So we've got the precipitation, the runoff, groundwater influences, the surface flow. Trying to quantify all this pre-project as well as some follow-up analysis for the wetlands. So what are the units we work with in this? So square feet, we work in acres. These are all English units. So the volume of runoff, we look at cubic feet and acre feet for volumes, and then inches over the watershed. So another source we look at in predictive side is what do we have for water volume going to the wetlands. So we look for mean annual precipitation. These are some charts that are in the, what's the original? Chow, yes, and Minnesota stormwater, the original Minnesota stormwater that I have in my bookcase that is still in printed form, has these in there. So what's interesting about this is, if you look for the Minneapolis area, the mean annual precipitation shows at about 26 inches, 28 inches. And if you look at pan evaporation, which is a little more evaporation than off lake evaporation, but if you look at that, it's 40 inches. So in that case, you have a net negative for water yield. But the one we also like to look at is mean annual lake data evaporation. And if you look at that line that would go through the Minneapolis area, it's about 30 inches. So if you look at 28 inches of precipitation volume versus the lake, 30 inches of evaporation, kind of roughly equal. But the important point of this is that on a change in land development, that the change in watershed going into a wetland is very important. It's one of the things we like to look at very closely. So when we get a development plan coming in, there's a grading and drainage plan that shows up as well as a hydrology report. The hydrology report will have a number of figures in there. Most important things we look at are the figures showing the watershed delineation for what's going into the wetland, to see that pre to post it will not be starved of water, or it will get much more water and actually change the type of water. So that's how I would work with Matt to see what is that type of wetland and can it stand a change, because in almost all cases there's no developer or engineer that can match that same volume pre to post perfectly. There's always going to be some change. So it's our role then to see, is that change significant? And if it is, what does it mean? So here's just a figure showing how somebody came up with a delineation for these watershed areas to determine what it was under that condition. So then we look at what is that runoff? So we look at the rainfall and have the initial abstractions, so that's wetting for leaves and road surfaces minus infiltration, and that gets what the watershed runoff yield is. So another thing we look at on the wetland side for the review point is event-based versus long-term simulation. So most developers like to do the event-based because it's just specific for that site and they don't need a lot of data for it. A long-term simulation, we like to have 10 to 30 years of record to see what is going to happen to that wetland over that period of time. So it's easy to ask for the event-based. In some cases where we have a significant wetland feature, we will ask for a long-term simulation, and those are done. It's been a long time since I saw anybody do it on a spreadsheet method. Most cases now it's all done in a computer simulation. So again, for runoff, the initial abstractions, then you've got rainfall taken up by leaf surfaces and pavements, and this includes depressional storage. So that's how much water yield you can get to the wetland. So then you've got infiltration, and then these rates depend on factors such as the rainfall rates, soil types, and initial soil moisture. Primarily we see the Nrcs methodology used. So we also see the swim model used for the long-term simulations. So here's a summary of the formula for the Nrcs methods. So the standard method for event-based hydrology, and it has been adapted to some long-term simulations. The important thing on this one is we always fall to that lower number, the curve number, which was developed back in the 1960s by hydrologists out of the Lincoln office, Lincoln, Nebraska office. And we've really bought into that over time because we haven't changed these curve number rates in ages, ever since I started working in this field. So it's done under hydrologic soil group, A being sand, D being clay, and you pick your type of soil condition, your land use condition. So you look at your existing condition and your post condition to see what the watershed change is going to be, and then take an estimate of what the runoff yield change will be. So this is just a continuation of that. This one happens to show urban areas as well. So once the runoff is estimated, the ZEG can be used to estimate runoff versus time of the hydrograph given of time of concentration. So on the Nrcs method, which is the most common one we see, because it's also put into XP Swim, HydroCAD, and some other computer models. Once you know this methodology, it applies to almost every computer model that we see. So time of concentration is important for this. This is important to get to the peak flow, generally. So we look at what's considered for sheet flow, coming off of a hard surface such as a parking lot, shallow concentrated flow, coming through some backyards maybe, and then of course channel and pipe flow, which where it starts being collected. So just to kind of pull this together, so HydroCAD is a very popular model we have for estimating water yield into wetlands. So it looks at rainfall depth, watershed delineation, takes the curve number, and then the time of concentration. And those all go into the model to determine the hydrograph, which predicts both the peak rate, time of the peak, and the volume of runoff flowing out of that wetland. So as a regulator, on that side, we look at the pre-development to the post-development condition. We also check the curve numbers, time of concentration, so those may vary, and then how that runoff and discharge rate will change. And then we use the ponds and other methods to control the runoff to kind of lower it so downstream impacts aren't seen, or to hold more water on site for recharge purposes. So one of the hard things for developers to come in and kind of prove their case to us is we want accurate data when they show up. So there is a rain gauge network across the state that is generally used, and we don't have if you put in too many rain gauges on sites unless it's something like, say, the National Sports Center, where we asked for additional monitoring there. Groundwater has really been a problem to get our hands around because we need a longer-term simulation. But for a developer side, they don't have 3 years generally to do that. They want to get stuff done in 6 months to a year at the outside. So the groundwater is more of a problem, and we try and look at what we have for existing records. Then infiltration rates, well, they very dependent upon the modeling, and as you know, post-construction conditions change from what is estimated on the grading plan anyway. So it's another thing we need to use some judgment on. And then another one is stream flow gauging. So we determine the rating curve. This doesn't necessarily apply to all wetlands, but it does help. Something we need to keep in mind as flow is going off of the site, how this is determined. So, and it's just some rules of thumb. So in the metro area, we've got rainfall at about 28 inches. We've got evapotranspiration and water losses. So generally, we've got a water yield of about 5 inches in any one area. So that kind of summarizes the general side. Now it's over to Joel to talk about specifics more related to wetlands and some case studies that he's worked on that I had experience kind of being on the opposite side of the table with.
Questions so far, Fred?
My guess is they probably know that part pretty well already.
How many hydrologists are in the room? Well, that's good. That's good.
Better up your game then.
I took this out of the book from Wisconsin, but applies fairly well here. It's kind of a quick summary of what types of wetlands you have to work with, and it kind of plays into your hydrology. What drives the hydrology? And some of the examples I want to bring up with is it's good to kind of review some of these. We can go through fairly quickly. This one here, we've got surface water depression. This is really important. Where is your groundwater relative to the bottom or relative to your wetland surface? How close that is. In this case here, I would guess that this would be one that Ed's been talking about quite a bit. It's driven mostly by surface hydrology. There may be some groundwater component to this, but how far is this distance? So that's one we call it surface water depression in the surface water, as you suggest. That would be driving the hydrology. Surface water slope. Okay, so now it's right by a stream or river. So how much of this is inundating this area? Where are we at regarding what? This is one we'll come to in one of the examples I've got coming up. So this is it's driven quite by the river. Keep in mind what's driving the hydrology on these wetlands. Groundwater depression. We've got a lot of different actions going on. Is the groundwater coming in all the time? Is the groundwater coming in and leaving? So you've got this going on. This one here, it's a little bit different from this one. I haven't used this for a while. Summer. You can see there's, in groundwater, there's all kinds of different options you gotta look at. This is probably the more difficult one to deal with. And we'll have an example of that coming up with one of these south farms. Groundwater slope. There's no, stream is shown off the page here. You've got groundwater coming in, it's coming out of the bank. Here's your wetland. So this would be, the stream flow is not driving it, the groundwater is. So groundwater slope. So I want to jump right into some examples, and I think Ed was just talking about this one here, is Rehbein Sod Farm. Rehbein owned about 240 acres right here. This is 109th and Lexington. You can kind of see the drainage there was, you've got the laterals and main ditch system going through. This whole area, the groundwater levels or the water levels in this whole area are actually governed by a culvert that goes underneath 35W here. Do you know how they set that culvert originally? What the problem was? So MnDOT came in here and there was some goof in how the culvert elevation was set. It was set about 4 feet too high, which didn't drain these areas very well. The court case lasted for years. These sod farms got very wet, and most of Rehbein's property here turned into cattails because it had hydric soils, it had plenty of water, and so this whole thing became a wetland. The lawsuit finally got settled. This culvert was lowered 4 feet, and as a result, these wetlands drain quite well again. And the question is, okay, how much of this area is now upland and how much is wetland? And when you look at the location here at Lexington, 109th, and look at the development coming through here, this becomes very valuable property and every acre counts. So what are we going to do?
So I can add my 2 cents on that one. So about almost 30 years ago, I was also the engineer for the Rice Creek Watershed. And one of my first days on the job, one of the managers said, Ed, we need to get that culvert on, and that's County Ditch 5362. You need to lower that. Go ahead and lower it. So ditch law is one of the other aspects of the work that I do that kind of that trumps other parts of the stuff I work on. So you have to find the records to document the fact of how you can lower a culvert on a county ditch system. Finding records that were done from 1890 to 1910, you could have nail inside of post. That's it for the reference point. So what do you do with that? So you try and establish some grade line to determine what this ditch is so you can get it lowered, and then that's just the ditch law. So now I can say, okay, that culvert was probably placed too high based on the information we have, sketchy although it is, because oftentimes you'd have 3 engineers working on this, some project proponent to do it, in my case, the regulator side, and then somebody, say, from the DNR. We all have three different numbers. Who's right? We're all coming at it, we think, with some degree of integrity and trying to get it right. We all have 3 different numbers, so it's kind of a negotiated settlement is what it kind of turned out to be on what that culvert elevation should be. So ditch law becomes a big part of the wetland hydrology component that I end up working on. And I know in Coon Creek there's 110 miles of county ditches. It's great for business because there's always some flap about it. Rice Creek's got, I think, 200 miles of it. So it's interesting work because you end up working with the attorneys, the other side of it, and the developer side, and trying to piece all that together. And then you get that done, and then now you have to start looking at the wetland issues, and that's where the Corps comes in, and you may not get an answer. I don't know if anybody here is from the Corps, but getting an answer is kind of slow when it comes to wetland drainage and county ditches. It just takes a while. It's one of those things. But anyway, so that's I got involved in this and a long time, even before Joel got involved in how he ended up actually solving it.
It's interesting to know when MnDOT put the culvert back in, they oversized it and then made it 3 feet deeper than what they thought it should be, and then put a stop log in so there was a variable, so they could come back and change the elevation if needed, so they weren't going to make the same mistake twice. So that culvert underneath there has a nice stop log in front of it, so it drops about 3 feet at that point. So if they wanted to drain more, they could. This is just a zoomed in wetland people are going to be looking for wetland signatures coming through here. This was a very difficult site to figure out. The hydrology is driven by the ditch flow or the water coming through it, so it flows laterally out of the ditches into the sod fields as well as percolate through the sod fields. So you have the infiltration rate varying in this peat material. The infiltration rate coming in vertically is a lot slower than horizontally because of the way the peat is laid down. So your peat layers layer on top of each other, so water can actually go horizontally through the material quicker than it can do vertically. So the hydrology is complicated in that regard. So if you're trying to figure out the modeling on this, it's difficult. So we were considering that this is driven by flow coming through the ditch. Rehbein wanted to develop this corner of the wetland. This is the most valuable piece of property. You're right in the intersection. And given that it was a mosaic, or we considered it was a mosaic of wetlands, we were going to consolidate the impacts here, create wetlands on the west side of the property, and kind of consolidate wetlands over here, and have upland here. That was kind of the general development plan to get through. The question is, how much of this is upland and how much was wetland? So this is pre-culvert lowering. So this is, as you recall, the culvert's way down here. So pre-culvert, when you're flooded 3 feet too high, you can imagine the whole thing is considered a wetland. So there's no, you had this small property here, and I think because Rehbein used their barn right here, and when they had excess fill material on a site before the wetland law went in, they put fill here, and this got to be the high ground. The rest of it, it's pretty much considered wetland pre-culvert. Now, when we got involved, they had lowered the culvert maybe 2-3 years later, and we were trying to figure out, okay, what is the scope and effect of these ditches, and how much of this area is upland? So if you look at it simplistically, you can go and say, we have different types of soils. Based on those soils, your scope and effect will vary. That's what you've got here. You've got a ditch here. This soil type might be a little bit more sandy than this right here. There are really deep peat regions. And I think this is one of the very, there's 19 feet of peat right here. This was more sandy, so your scope and effect would be different. So just based on scope and effect, you can come up with a map like this and say, okay, here's the wetlands that are on site based on that. Presented that to the Corps of Engineers, who was kind of leading on this one. They looked at it and said, that's nice, but we'd like piezometer data. We'd like to put some measurements and give us 3 to 5 years of data so we can kind of see how the groundwater on different transects through here varies, so that we can see the scope and effect, because we don't believe your equations because of this and this and the other thing. So we're looking at 3 to 5 years of monitoring. You had an idea of, you could have just said, hey, let us develop it and then go after the fact and show that it might be quicker. So looking at that time period, Rehbein's looking at, we'd really like to get, is there a faster way to do it? Can we accelerate this? So we used groundwater models such as ModFlow, presented that to the Corps. There's always reasons that they weren't quite comfortable with it. We also did numerous vegetation surveys, after the fact. So this has been going on for quite a while. This is one of the scope and effect equations, the Van Schilkart equation. So you can kind of see, if you say this part here is your ditch, these are your 2 laterals of your ditch, the ditch will be flowing out of the page, you'll see that the groundwater would have this parabolic shape between these points. So if this is parabolic shape, this is the part that's not getting drained, this part is getting drained. So there's your ditch. And the question is, how much of that parabola comes up to a point where we can say this is drained, or this is drained and that's not. So the amount of area between here is significant. This also is a problem too, because this is where we want to develop. And if you look at that, that's the point that's most wet. So all your impacts are going to end up here, and you're going to try to mitigate with upland over there. So this was a hard sell to the Corps to get done. This was when they're under the pressure, really pressure to keep metro area wetland impacts minimized. And this was a big chunk that was going to. So we were really scrutinized on this one. This was the development plan. As you can see, all the development was stuck right here. this was what we were saying was going to be impacted. Here's our wetland impacts. That's what's, it's big enough to say, oh man, this is a big deal. This was under a lot of scrutiny by the court. What we were trying to do was sell the after the fact. Here's all your wetlands you had before. And if you recall, there's quite a bit of upland through here. We were going to change this whole thing to wetland and also add these wildlife corridors through here. This was going to be donated to the city for a park and a green space. So this whole area would turn into a green space and wetland if they would give us this for upland, for development. Seemed like an easy sell. Ramsey Town Center came through here. We worked on this for about 5 years. Ramsey Town Center was another project up in Anoka, Sandplain up near Ramsey. Rehbein was a little overextended in both these places. As a consultant, I was working for Rehbein. They're a very good client. The issue was that Joel will pay you as soon as we can get this developed. So as a good a client as they were, we just continued to say, okay, that's fine. Our invoices for our work in monitoring this area and presenting all this information to the court for 5 years was up at $250,000. So as a small company, this is before Wenck, small company, we're getting out there, but we're assured by Rehbein that we get paid as soon as it gets sold. Rehbein went belly up as a result of Ramsey Town Center and probably this one, and we're going, that was a bit of a problem. In the end, I don't think the area, I asked Tony Castor, another wetland person here, he was at Coon Creek when I was working for Coon Creek. Tony drives by here quite a bit. He just went to lunch with him over the lunch hour. He said this area is still not developed. The bank ended up buying it. But that's a case where I think if we'd gotten it permitted, if it worked through, I think it would have been a neat space. It still can be, but the whole idea is the wetlands there were just too difficult to get solved and get right. Any questions on that? By the way, there are about, I would say 65 piezometer records that we have for there, and that's probably the most instrumented wetland in the metro area. So there's a lot, and almost every consultant has worked a little bit on there. Peterson was in there. We had, there's a range of people that have looked at the site. And the one right, go ahead.
How did the piezometer data line up with what you modeled?
We thought it lined up very well. We were able to show that.
How does the Corps think it lined up? I think is
just didn't believe it quite. They wanted more data. We even came up with a new method outside the Van Schilkart that was better than Van Schilkart to work with sap farms. So we came up with, presented at a water resources conference. I want to say about 10, 15 years ago. It was a really cool way to look at this and get this worked out based on those piezometer records. So the Corps again didn't quite accept them. Yes.
I was wondering, is it standard practice for the client not to pay until the site's developed, or is it because of the time frame and risk for the site?
It's a good question. So this is pre-2008 or 2007, 2008 when the development crash happened. So before then, there was so much development work and it was coming so fast and things were just booming. And that wasn't too bad of a deal. If you knew your client, they can ask you to do that, and you knew that this is going to sell pretty quick, and you just go ahead and do it. This was a pretty big deal. And again, Rehbein was a big client. We just didn't think that we had much to risk. So in that case, in that time, it was not a bad thing for a consultant to do that.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions? Since we're going through Coon Creek quite a bit, I also was going to show this National Sports Center. It's still up in Coon Creek. There's some parts in Rice. Note the proximity of this site to the airport. USGS topo shows lots of wetland signature, wetland symbols around here. This red line here is property we were asked to develop for a golf course, National Youth Golf Center. So we were early on going to help them work with this, but again, they had lots of wetlands to work with. You're right next to the ditch. How do you deal with these wetlands? These are the delineated wetlands in the area, quite a bit. Again, here's your airport. National Sports Center right here, this is where the soccer fields are. So we identified these areas here as the impact. It turned out to be about 7 acres. Again, at that time, that's a lot of area. Blaine, not so much, but again, it's significant. And to permit this was quite a deal. We had to do quite a bit of environmental stuff. But to mitigate for this, it wasn't hard. You're developing a golf course. There's plenty of places you can use for sand traps or just rough areas. So there's places we can mitigate. It was just how do we get it done? How do we justify that? How do we work with this? This became a boardwalk through here to minimize those impacts. This RPZ zone, runway protection zone, got to be a real issue. If we're creating mitigation areas here, we couldn't put mitigation areas in the runway protection zone, so this wouldn't do that. For obvious reasons, they don't want birds right at takeoff, so that's not a good thing. Here was where we wanted to do our mitigation, but again, the proximity to the airport was one of the permitting issues. But for this presentation here, can you get the wetland hydrology to it? The whole area is an open sand plain. All you really need to do is get your wetland low enough to connect to that sand plain or the groundwater hydrology. You have groundwater that has surface characteristics. You can look at different wetlands here and match the elevation of them, and you can tie that into the groundwater elevation. The trick here was you're next to the airport. They did not want standing water. So that's a duck, or you're asking for waterfall. So we needed to bring the wetlands down to a point where you can get the hydrology, but not too much. So just create a type 2 if you can, no more. And it's kind of tricky for the scope and effect of that drainage system coming through there. Back up a little bit. Oops.
So I could point out something from the ditch engineer side. That's in the upper reaches of one of the county ditches. So, and they're actually the headwaters of it. When that occurs and somebody needs to have a wetland creation, we do allow a ditch plug in that case if it's only affecting their property so they can hold more water back. In this case, say it's compounded by the fact now you've got open water, and that, for that solution, now you're attracting waterfall where you don't want them. But weather areas where we've got ditch systems that end on somebody's property, if they want to put in a ditch plug and do a wetland creation, it's just fine. We can work with ditch law on that. So this one, yeah, you can do it, but you got a little compromise issue with it because of the waterfall.
So I think the challenge here was just trying to get the elevation of these mitigation areas right. So again, this is more a blow up of the impacts. You can see the corner of our mitigation area right here. Here's the mitigation site. You can see how it ties in really easily with the green, here's the greens, with your fairways, how that works in. This gets to be a low depression area. You put your tee boxes over here. So you can get this worked out with the golf course designed really easily. The question is, how do you get that elevation? Yes?
As we have increasingly wet years, are we still functioning as type 2?
You've been
No,
there.
I don't know if they've changed that.
Is there more flow in the ditch? Is the ditch water level maintained? I think the ditch is not flowing deeper, is it?
No, we keep the ditches clean because the ditches are on a 4-year inspection and they're maintained regularly because it's really only drainage system in the area. So they're cleaned to their design grade, but we still reference, as I said, between the original ditch plans. So they're good to go.
So I think that would be, it's a good question in terms of where would I expect it to be? I would expect it to mirror the ditch level.
Okay.
That's what it's driven by, so if the ditches are still doing good, we're good. I think it's doing well. It's a good question. We had to monitor, I think it was 3 to 5 years to prove that our hydrology was met. We did put gasometers in here and had them take data, and we had to convince Coon Creek that it's working. Tim, please pay our money back. We want the money. Questions on that? So again, you had your greens, you driving places up here, you keep these at whatever elevation you want, and the idea was you wanted taller grasses or taller vegetation to keep the geese out. Ducks okay, geese not so good. This one's more recent, this is a fairly recent one. We've done a bit of work in Minnesota River floodplain. I think our first stuff was way, I want to say this about 10 years ago with the Burnsville landfill. I think we've also done other things, other developments in this floodplain, in the Minnesota River floodplain. It's a nice place to work because it's got a lot of data. Here's just an overall picture of Minnesota River floodplain. Here's your Minnesota. I believe this is Shakopee and this is probably Eden Prairie. You can't see the blue lines, but in this reach there are 10 sections, I believe. 10 river sections that are cut through. The Corps of Engineers has a really nice river model to indicate flood levels coming through here at various discharges. So it's really handy to have. So if you know what your flow is in your river, you can come up and determine what the flow level is. These wetlands here in the floodplain are heavily driven by the river levels. So if you're looking for inundation over a 14-day period, it's likely due to the Minnesota River. Given its drainage area, I think it's 16,800 square miles draining to this point. So the driving water for these wetlands on the floodplain is the Minnesota River. You could say, well, what about the water coming from, the groundwater coming from the bluffs? Yes, it's a component that adds water to this, but it eventually gets to the river. Is that going to be sustaining the wetland here for 14 days? I'm not sure. It could increase it. But if you're going to be looking at a conservative number for wetland elevation, you probably would be looking at the river. You could also argue that, okay, what about, you pick one of the watersheds coming in, this would be Bluff Creek or something like that. Would Bluff Creek be driving the wetland in this case? It's an urban area right adjacent to it. Again, the time of concentration from water coming from the urban area here is maybe a day or two. The time of concentration coming from 16,000 square miles is going to be, it's going to take about a couple weeks to get here, and it's going to stay here for quite a while. So if you're looking for a 14-day duration, the river is what's going to drive your hydrology for this area. So in terms of hydrology, this is kind of one of the more unique areas. So recently we were looking at a site trying to figure out what elevation is maintained in that floodplain over a 14-day period in the growing season. So USGS has a really cool gauge, lots of record in Jordan, Minnesota, which is about 20 miles upstream. But still, if you look at the drainage area coming here, that's capturing 97% of the drainage area coming through here. We just ignored any local drainage downstream of Jordan. Just ignore that flow. That's probably going to be gone by the time we're looking at the 14-day duration. So we took flow records at Jordan and used them to figure out the hydrology of these wetlands. And then that was at 14 days during growing season from May through October. So we were able to parse out the river data and just take May through October and then look for the peak flow that occurred that was maintained over a 14-day period. It's So in a spreadsheet, you can download all that data and get this information quite quickly. So I think I've already gone through this where, you know, the water sources here are your creeks, groundwater, and this Minnesota River. This is the one that we figured was dry. In the area we're looking at, all the aerial photography that they looked at for wetland delineation was done in the last 10 years. So I hope that 2008 to now, they had all these aerial photos and they've done their delineation based on that. My task from the hydrology side is, can you match the elevations that were done by the delineation, or is there a way to get a higher elevation? Can we show a higher elevation? So should we look at the last 30 years or the last 10 years for this analysis? It's fairly easy to do both. Data is pretty quick and easy to manage. So we did both, and you can kind of see the effects on a 2-year flow, which is the kind of the normal, what you consider under normal circumstances. That's the flow that you look for wetland hydrology. So here's your 30-year analysis. You have 30 years of data here. You've done your statistical analysis, and from here you get your 2-year flow. 2-year flow is 22,000 CFS. So keep that in mind. This is the 2-year frequency. This is frequency analysis. 14-day duration. So at every year you're going to take your flow that you've got, and then for each year you're going to have a data point here. You plot them all up, and you come through and you figure out what is your 2-year frequency flow. That's right, 22,000 on that one. And if you take the last 10 years, 29,000. This makes a difference. It doesn't seem like much, but you got 29,000 versus 22. This will increase the flow level of the river to get that done. It also gives you a higher level for your wetland delineation. So are you going to use the last 10 years, or are you going to use the last 30? At least we were able to see the difference here in discharge. Now, being an hydrologist, you have to point this out too. How is the 2-year instantaneous flow relate to a 14-day duration flow, or in this case it's a 30-year record. So if you're looking for something that lasts for 14 days, we're coming up with 22. Something that comes instantaneously is 28,000. So that makes some sense. It's a way to data check to see, okay, is something that happens once during a period of a day, or this is something that's maintained over a period of 14 days. So it's a way to check your results. Another way to check results is just plot it up. This is discharge here. This is years. It goes back to 1985. Good year. Graduated then, so that's all that. You can go back here and take a look. Have the discharges in the river changed from back here to over here? You can kind of look at the darker dots here. In the last 10 years, it does look like this is a little bit higher. So you can kind of visually check to see how that's looking. Another way to look at it is if you take, this goes back down, this is 1935 to 2000 to current. This is flow rate, and this is average annual flows, Minnesota River at Jordan. And this is a 30-year running average. So at 30 years, you have a data point here to work with. And so this is a 30-year running average. So as you can see, if you're taking the last 30 years and plotting the average flow, it's continuing to increase. So back in 1965, you had about 3,500 CFS. That flow is now more than double. Is it climate change or is that drainage? But there is a change. So again, what would you use for wetland delineation here? Are you going to use the last 10 years or are you going to use the last 30 years? So we can translate flow to elevation using that flow model that was based on stuff work by the Corps of Engineers and USGS. Nrcs model. Again, we have these numerous stations through here to figure out flow levels. This is river miles, and this is elevation, and you can see how the flow, water levels track for different floods. This is a 10-year flow coming through here. We put in 2-year flows. We came in at these flow levels for these particular locations. These are different historical ones. These are modeled flows. So they're able to calibrate this data to actual data to get the model to work. So in the end, we have a really good way of translating flow rates to elevations at a particular point in the river using that model. So at the one spot we're looking at, we were looking at these different elevations based on these flows. And we were looking at some of these flows here. So you can see here, this is 30-year, 2-year. We have a flow of 707.1. This is with the 14-day growing period, 705, and this is for the 30-year record. So you can work with a 705 or this 10-year record, 707. So we have about 1.5 foot more, or even more, change between a 30-year record and a 10-year record. But that's a significant bounce in elevation for that wetland. If you're doing a wetland bank, it turns out to be a lot of area. So this can be a big number. And we have a defense for it in this analysis. Questions? Yes?
Did you consider the antecedent precip for the years, like you have to do for aerial reviews for wetlands?
We did not. It was just strictly based on river flow. So it kind of goes into, that's already taken into account with the river flow. So you're looking at river flow, which would take into account, was it wet prior to then or not? So I think the antecedent conditions would be part of the flow record that you did.
Because you typically either remove non-normal years or have to do a comparison of both when you're doing that. So if you're not correcting for that, wouldn't you get a different answer?
So let's back up a little bit and maybe I can work with this. So we did our statistical analysis using the last 10 years. So some of those would be dry, some of those would be wet. And from that forecasted the 2-year flow. A hydrologist is saying you only had 10 years of data to work with. You're doing a statistical analysis. You really should add more data to it to get more confidence in the results. And I think that's where you come up with some of these error bands. I'm trying to back into your question for antecedent. You have less wet and dry years in here, so you're going to have your variability is going to be not as much if you have a 30-year. These error bands are tighter. We have more data, but that's why I wanted to put this picture up. These data look higher than the rest of them. We could argue that you use the last 10 years, and they include wet and dry. I'm not sure if it answers your question, but we'll work with it. Other questions I can't answer? Yes?
Well, this is just consistent with climate change. It's getting wetter and we're getting more variability in the size of the precipitation events.
And
So if you use a longer period, it's not going to be predictive for the future because it's wetter than it used to be.
And, I would agree there, and that's kind of what we'd like to present to the Corps. And the other thing we'd like to present is also the fact that here's your difference in water elevation that we're looking at. We did them both. You can take a look at them both. They both work for our site, so we'll kind of pick one or pick a range or work with us on this and help us with this. But I would argue that climate change is more indicative in the last 10 years. Other questions? Yeah.
So you said that you were doing this for a mitigation bank?
We've done various different sites. Some, for example, with the mitigation bank, yes, you need an elevation for that, and that varies depending on the elevation. But also, like Burnsville landfill, they're just looking for where can they put their fill material, how far can they come in, what's going to be impacted. So that elevation would drive that.
And so when you're working with the Corps or another client, when you're doing like a 10-year or even a 30-year, those error bands are they're still pretty wide. Are you looking at like the upper 95% and the lower 95% confidence interval to make sure that you're using like something that is appropriately conservative, or are you really just taking that mean and saying this is going to be the elevation?
So far, we just worked with the mean and looked at, here's the 30-year, here's the last 10 years. We haven't looked at the confidence, error confidence. We just said, okay, here's the zone we're working in. If we can get agreement anywhere in that zone, I think we have something to work with. So can we pin it down to the 10th of a foot? No. But can we come within the nearest foot? I think we have something close. If I was asked, Joel, can you get the elevation at 704? Can you prove the 704 will work? My lowest number was 705.5. And I said, yeah, I can take 704 easily. Well, how much higher can you get it? So this is what you end up with a consultant. I thought I'd cleared the bar, but no, maybe get it higher, because this is a significant number in terms of this particular site. Other questions? I think that's all I've got. Came back from Arizona, I think it was a couple weeks ago. My brother rented an Airbnb, a whole house, a 5-bedroom Airbnb, and I come from a big family. Invites all the siblings down. Hey, come on down. I've got the house for you. Don't worry about it. Get to Arizona, and my wife says, "How come you're always getting these hydrology things? How come you're taking pictures of our graduate?" This was at a botanical garden down there, really cool place. I suggest you visit. And saguaro can soak up a ton of water in a single rainstorm. So look at those units. We talked about units early on. Convert that to inches of rainfall. So get your ton of water and figure out the root system for those saguaros and say, okay, what does that actually mean? So there's your hydrology units. Creosote bush may enclose 1,000 cubic feet of soil. Okay, now what does that really mean, and how much water is in there? And this was pretty cool. Mesquite can extend 80 feet. Wow. I thought the switchgrass was at 12 feet was pretty impressive. So there's your desert hydrology I was able to pick up. You were saying they're doing something with mesquite where they've cut them.
Yeah, I know why I can get mesquite for my barbecue. It's because the ranchers like to get rid of it because it uses up so much water. It takes away their water yield for cattle. So they like to get rid of it. So I guess in that case I benefit because I can use mesquite to flavor my barbecue. Pluses and minuses to all this, I guess.
I think that's all I've got. What we got?
All right, thanks, everyone.